time, I want to talk about my Season 15 builds. This was the Cultist background played in the Blazing Desert DLC. Super fun playthrough, had a ton, just really enjoyed this one. Built builds specifically to synergize with the Cultist background. I'm going to talk you through all that and show you how I did it, and hopefully get you guys to get to play this kind of underplayed, underutilized background. All right, so here's the basic problem with the starting Cultist background that I really suggest you guys fix. And that is the way it was programmed initially, the frequency of the Cultist events is too low. You almost always are done your playthrough well before those events have had time to actually generate cultists with different things happening to them. The way the game is designed, it's supposed to be your cultists over time. You have the sacrifice event that shows up every so often. When you sacrifice a brother, your other cultists get all these stats from that, permanent stat additions. And anyone who's not a cultist in your team like panics and runs and leaves your team. And meanwhile, in between those sacrifices, your cultists are converting other people to the cult. That's what's supposed to happen. And that does happen in the base game. It just happens insanely slowly. By the time you get the max level cultist buff, which is a specific unique brother called a prophet, it's like day 400 in the base game. It's absurd how slow it is. And you just don't play campaigns that late very often. And when you do, by the time you're in day 400, you're just steamrolling everything because it's day 400 and you're steamrolling everything because you're just stacked beyond belief. So the mod that I ran for this was the Cultist mod put together. You can find it in my mod packs, and it just accelerates those events. We set it so every 5 days was a conversion and every 20 days was a sacrifice event. I might even recommend going a little bit faster. That still felt a bit slow. I still ended up playing out to like day 200 plus to get these final buffs going and to actually see these builds come to fruition. I'd probably accelerate that a little bit more, but the basic game mechanics were pretty fun for this. So here's what you end up doing as cultists. In the early game, you recruit as many cultists as you can. The background itself makes more cultists spawn on the map, and you also get events occasionally where cultists just join you out of nowhere. Cultists in general are pretty bad statted. They aren't very good brothers overall, but that's fine. In the early game, you build fodder characters with your cultists, just enough to keep your team progressing, keeping you able to take fights and build up your resources, particularly armors and weapons, but also to a lesser degree, maybe some famed items, maybe some money, etc. And these are the first two builds in here. These are early baddies and baddie throwers, as I'm calling them. And this is essentially taking brothers with terrible stats, with no stars, and trying to make them into something useful to begin with, just enough to keep your run going. These are basically a bunch of early game stats: Colossus, Gifted, some early game fast adaptation, which is really good on really crappy characters, but quite bad on very good characters, etc. Dodge, which is just a lot of stats. And then you let them die. Sooner or later, they die. What you just need to do is keep up your cultist count. The chance of conversion is based in part on the number of cultists in your pool. So you need to keep a large number of cultists alive. And then you basically one at a time recruit other backgrounds that can be converted. There's limitations to which backgrounds can be converted. I'm not going to cover that in this video, but essentially you take one brother, and then in between sacrifice events, you try to get him converted before the sacrifice. And then when the sacrifice occurs, he gets buffs instead of getting horrified and leave. And you can do a little bit of things with the powder, made the Necro Savant Ash powder that can fix brothers' moods, so you can keep some brothers even with sacrifice events. But that's the basic goal: convert brothers in between sacrifice events, trigger sacrifice events, sacrifice low-value brothers like Indebted that you can keep who can't be converted to cultists, and then they can be sacrificed. They can't leave because of mood, because they're indebted, and feed them to Davkul to make all of your other cultists stronger. What a cool background. Totally different than anything else in Battle Brothers. Really unique, something that you definitely want to play with. And what do you get from this? The background bonuses from cultists are initially resolve, both pure resolve, but also less resolve checks for things happening, taking damage or watching people die. It doesn't cause resolve checks. Then you get stamina recovery, 2 extra stamina recovery per turn, bringing all your brothers from 15 to 17. Then you get extra HP. You get 20 extra HP, which is a ton of HP. Then you get 5 melee defense and 5 range defense. And then finally, the last bonus that everybody can get is it's the chosen bonus, which I think is part of the 5 melee, 5 range defense, which also gives you immunity to wounds in that fight. So you ignore wounds for that fight. They don't impact you till next fight. And then The final level, which only one brother can get, is the Prophet level. And the Prophet level gives you an ability for 6 AP that gives everybody on your team who's a cultist 10 stamina back instantly. Okay, so taken as a whole, what does this mean? It means you're working with lower tier backgrounds because you have to get converted backgrounds, and most of the high tiers cannot be converted unless they are either dumb or have brain damage. So you're working with lower tier backgrounds, but you get a ton of stats through the cultist leveling process as they become higher tier cultists. And a lot of those stats are based around stamina. You end up with 17 stamina regen plus 10 every round, or maybe realistically it's about another 5 per round because you can't run the cultist the Prophet every single round. You can basically run it every other round. So you end up with around 22 stamina regen per round on average for all of your dudes before things like stamina pots or iron lungs. That's so cool. That's so different. That's so much more stamina than other backgrounds. So what did we do? I built, in this playthrough, I built a bunch of brothers who were designed to utilize stamina. So what does stamina do for you? What does max stamina actually do for you in this game, or stamina recovery per round give you in this game? 2 abilities really stick out to me. The first of these is Adrenaline, and the second is Berserk. So Berserk lets you attack more often if you get kills, which costs you more stamina because you're swinging your weapon more. And Adrenaline lets you, for the cost of 1 AP and a bunch of stam, like 20 stam or something like this, go first next round, regardless of your initiative. And I built the entire set of builds to essentially take advantage of those facts. So last playthrough with the Gladiators, I did a lot of 0 stam stuff, which was really fun and really different. And I had a lot of low stamina backgrounds. And this playthrough, I wanted to do something different, something contrary to that, like opposite that as much as possible. So after the early game, the early baddies and the baddie throwers, I built one of these Catal damage builds again, because I thought this was pretty good. Essentially not changed much from the Viper build in the Gladiator season. This is the two-handed mace swing at the end of a turn to daze a target, then quick handing swap to the Catal dagger, utilizing the extra damage you do to daze targets with that weapon. And then the beginning of next round, you Adrenaline to go first, and then, or just go first because the opponent is dazed and you're not, and then you triple stab it with the Catal dagger for additional damage on a dazed target. So built some of these, pretty pleased with that. I could build these Battle Forged in this playthrough because we had so much stamina available to us. And I dropped Recover out of this build because the cultists are generating their own stamina for this. Found that to be just fine. This build, again, was very good. Scales nicely with multiple maces on your team. I built a bunch of throwers, or 2 throwers in this playthrough as well. I gave up on range weapons in between last playthrough and this playthrough. I didn't feel the need for guns, crossbows, or bows in this playthrough. It was noticeably worse versus necromancers, but pretty much only versus necromancers, and instead utilized Adrenaline throwers with bags and belts. This is kind of nice synergies for some of the perk changes. Duelist got a buff. The perk itself got a buff. You can now have nets or throwing grenades in your offhand without compromising the penetration buff that throwing weapons get from having the Duelist perk. So the Duelist throwers now, they can carry a net, they can carry a smoke grenade if I need to utilize those for utility, and they are running Adrenaline and throwing weapons, and they can carry a lot of throwing weapons because they're running bags and belts, which means they are insanely high damage dealing brothers, particularly versus goblins, where they one-shot goblins. They just decimate goblin lines. I had a lot of fun with this build. Adrenaline is one of these abilities that gets better en masse, where if all your brothers have it, it's very impactful. If one of your brothers has it, it's not that impactful kind of deal. So I tried to build as many brothers in this playthrough as possible with Adrenaline. The only exception was these Catal mace builds don't really work that great with Adrenaline. I still ended up taking it. Spoilers, so cover your ears if you don't want to know anything about the new famed location. I did take the 2 bonus perk points from the famed location and I applied them to this build to actually add Adrenaline to this build. And the problem with that is the mace plus dagger is 9 AP. So you only sometimes were able to use adrenaline. Basically, the turns where you got a berserk proc off, you could still use adrenaline, but not all of the turns. So sometimes it was a little bit clunky, that 1 AP cost to new adrenaline. But for the rest of the builds, adrenaline fit in really nicely. We have a lot of stamina to play with the stamina regen, so we can use adrenaline multiple times in a fight, and the whole team is running it, so the whole team can burst when we want to burst and doesn't have to burst when we don't want to burst. So we can do we can wait until, like, for example, versus goblins, you don't move forward until the goblins have taken the turn, then you move as far forward as you can, adrenaline, and go first and kill a wave of goblins before they can react, which is just incredible. So the thrower build was extremely good for that. Really enjoyed this build a lot. I went with two-handed DPS berserk builds, which were pretty meta when adrenaline cost only 0 AP and that everyone was running recover and adrenaline. But I built that with cultists, because the cultists have their own source of stamina regen that is not recover. So I could do away with recover. The downside of recover, of course, being that you have to spend basically a full turn to recover, and it requires a ton of max stamina to really get a lot of value out of it. We could get stamina back in a different way. This build is basically designed to do as much damage as possible with a two-handed weapon and have adrenaline, so we could get the burst synergy going. This was super fun to have the whole team just run forward and take their turns out of order, doing tons of damage, was just great. Berserk for multiple attacks with two-handed weapons is always very fun. It's just stamina intensive. We got to use two-handed secondary modes like sweep attacks, which you normally can't use too much of because, again, they're very stamina intensive. Just really fun build for this. This was the primary DPS build for the team. Just tried to build basically as many of these as possible if I wasn't compromising like my couple throwers, etc. I did do a little bit of the low stam, zero stam builds. The zero stam builds weren't as good in this playthrough, and I didn't want to build very many of them. I ended up building one because essentially an early brother who had good melee attack and good melee defense, but rolled very poorly on fatigue, and I wanted to use him as much as possible. But it wasn't a build I wanted to use because I was trying to take advantage of the stamina recovery of the cultists, and this build specifically is designed to not have to worry about stamina recovery. Now, you can do some cheeky things with this, like substitute in a orc axe instead of a mansplitter instead of a the standard two-handed regular human axe, because you have that extra stamina recovery per turn. It's not quite perfect. It's still a little bit short of what you need, but if you're also running the profit buff, then you can still have enough stamina recovery to move and swing that axe every single turn, provided you have enough total stamina, which is a bit more than 20. Maybe I just adjust that and say like 25 if you want to do that kind of combination. But you don't want to build a lot of the zero stam builds with this playthrough because it doesn't synergize with what the cultists do particularly, but still I did use a little bit. I did use duelists. I did end up dropping rotate on this build and ended up running adrenaline. Had some thought to maybe drop the weapon spec on the duelist too. A lot of times with the duelist, I don't care so much about the secondary mode for the one-handed weapon. I'm using a one-handed weapon because I picked up a famed weapon and it generally has very good stats, and I'm using it mostly for damage. So if you were to potentially drop weapon spec, you could put in some other type of ability here, maybe quick hands for something like actually being able to use grenades, or reach weapon perhaps, or something like rotate, or maybe even recover if you needed to, because you have stamina regeneration from another source. So the minus stamina cost of swinging a duelist weapon a couple times per turn isn't quite as noticeable. But then again, maybe you just want to use an orc weapon, in which case you probably do want the stamina reduction from weapon spec. I found the duelist builds to be fine, but really what stole the show for me in this cultist playthrough was the berserk adrenaline two-handers for me. Not always the case for duelists. Normally duelists are very good, and they weren't bad in this one. It's just this other build worked really well with the cultist synergies. And then finally, I used my standard goblin banner build, which is just a combination of whip and rally to have both the ability to keep your brothers from panicking, but also disarms to make your progression a little bit more smooth. I could drop recover from this build to run footwork and rotate. I find my banner to be the squishiest guy on my team because he has no melee defense at all and is just HP tanking essentially. I am trying to keep him out of harm's way as much as possible so he doesn't get rolled on by enemies and killed, mostly because it's a pain to reroll banners. You have to go find a banner and level them, etc. I was really pleased with the synergies of this playthrough. Although I wish I had tweaked the mod a little bit to make it faster, I ended up getting a fair number of brothers with a fair number of cultist buffs, which made it entertaining. I tried to use the, I succeeded in this. I used the new retinue member, the the surgeon who makes it so your first time a brother is permanently wounded, the first time a brother dies, they're struck down as opposed to killed if they had no existing permanent injury. And what this means you can do is you can take backgrounds that cultists cannot normally convert, like any normal background or like a hedge knight or something. And normally for the cultists to convert one of those, you'd have to get them dumb, or they wouldn't be able to be converted at all, or sometimes they're just not capable of being converted. For example, you can't convert nobles to begin with, right? But if they're brain damaged, they can be converted. And brain damage is like, I think there's like 13 or 14 different permanent injuries you can get when you're struck down. But that's not super low probability. That's just not high probability. And what you ended up doing is I spent some money and time taking good rolls on brothers from backgrounds that I would not normally be able to recruit and getting them killed until they had brain damage. And once they had brain damage, they could be converted to the cult. And then I had cultists with really good stats from a really cool background, and then they were now the next round of the next generation of cultists growing up, all brain damaged, low initiative, but using adrenaline to surpass low initiative with even more stats from brain damage. Anyways, so I had a lot of fun with the synergies that you could do with the cultist run. It was very different from my gladiator run, led to some builds and play styles that were totally different, with things like adrenaline and heavy stamina usage, and just all around made for a very fun and different experience. Again, if you do choose to try this on your own, please make sure to download the mod that makes the cultist fence a little bit more a little bit faster, so that you don't have to spend 400 days playing this run. You can do it in more like 200 days. Wasn't the fastest run I've ever played for sure, but it still was extremely enjoyable. Anyways, guys, hopefully this summary of kind of the builds for this and what to do with that was fun for you guys. I know it's another spreadsheet video, but hey, this is the FilthyRobot channel. We do spreadsheet videos from time to time around here. Hopefully you guys enjoy it as much as I do. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.